"Clean my shoes," Derek barked, the command slicing through the cold marble silence. The boardroom frozen under the harsh fluorescent glare. Jocelyn Harper, young, sharp-eyed, heart pounding against her chest, hesitated only a fraction before locking eyes with Victor Langley, the CEO whose reputation for ruthless precision could crush her career in an instant. Every movement in the room seemed amplified, the shuffle of papers, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the subtle creak of polished floors beneath expensive shoes. Jocelyn's hand trembled slightly over the contract she had noticed a deadly flaw in, one that could ruin millions, one that she might risk everything to reveal. Breath hitched, eyes scanning every tense face, knowing the next words could make or break her. And yet, she whispered a correction that could change everything, without realizing what this would cost her. Jocelyn Harper's shoes scuffed against the linoleum as she navigated the dim corridors of the skyscraper, the faint smell of industrial cleaner clinging to her uniform. She paused for a moment outside the maintenance closet, her fingers brushing over the worn lanyard that held her ID, a silent reminder of the life she inherited from her mother, a life of early mornings, long nights, and quiet resilience. The elevator dinged faintly in the distance, but she barely registered it, her mind already running through the details of the contract she had spotted during her brief sweep of the boardroom before the chaos. Each crease, each overlooked clause whispered danger. It was the kind of detail no one else would notice, the kind that could destroy someone unprepared. She had no title, no voice in that room, yet the weight of knowing pressed against her chest like the glass walls she polished daily. Her lunch had been a hastily packed sandwich, half of it already gone, yet she moved with deliberate care, knowing that patience often carried more power than privilege. Her eyes, dark and steady, caught the reflection of the marble staircase, the bright floors mocking the modesty of her worn sneakers. A janitor's daughter, yes, but one who carried quiet knowledge like armor, and empathy like a shield. She remembered the old man in the lobby she had helped the week before, lost in paperwork and confusion. A simple act of offering guidance and a smile had spared him hours of frustration. It wasn't heroism, she told herself, just attention to the human element, a recognition that even the smallest kindness could echo farther than anyone imagined. Jocelyn adjusted the strap of her bag, feeling the slight tremor in her wrist as adrenaline still hummed from the confrontation she had interrupted. She thought of the cubicle lights flickering in the offices above, the scent of coffee mingling with the sharp tang of polished metal, and the unspoken hierarchy pressing down on her like invisible hands. And yet, despite the fear, despite the possibility of being dismissed, ridiculed, or ignored, she held her spine straight, her voice measured, her intent clear, to act rightly, even when no one expected it. In that moment, the quiet strength of her life, years of overlooked diligence, the discipline learned from cleaning floors and filing forms, the sharpness honed by necessity, became a shield. She exhaled slowly, the air cold against her cheek, and realized something vital. Integrity didn't require applause, and courage wasn't measured by power or wealth. It was measured in the small, deliberate decisions, in the choices no one else would make. And as she stepped forward to speak again, clutching the edge of the contract, Jocelyn understood that the next words might define her. Not in title, not in status, but in the truth she dared to voice. And the consequences, both terrifying and transformative, hung silently just ahead. The boardroom doors gleamed under the midday sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting Victor Langley's tailored navy suit and the polished mahogany table that stretched like a barrier between him and the world below. He leaned back, fingers interlaced, eyes narrowing at Jocelyn Harper as if measuring her very worth, a faint smirk teasing the corner of his mouth. Not cruel, merely indifferent, the way one observes ants without thought. The assistants flitted silently, laptops open, murmurs muted, creating a quiet hum of efficiency that seemed to underscore her own absence of status. Marble floors echoed with her soft footsteps, each sound a reminder of how foreign her presence was among these titans of commerce. She felt it, the air, crisp and cool, like it belonged to another universe, one of control, of privilege, where the flick of a pen or the tilt of a head could decide fates. Victor spoke with clipped precision. "Do you have the figures, Jocelyn?" The words courteous enough to be professional, yet carrying the weight of subtle dismissal, a reminder that she was observed, tolerated, not respected. Her glance swept the room. The stock tickers blinking on sleek screens, the expensive coffee machines quietly steaming, the assistants' poised postures, all meticulous, all polished, but none warm, none human in the way she knew people could be. Her own heartbeat thudded in contrast, vibrant, raw, carrying urgency and empathy that these walls seemed allergic to. Every gesture, every pause she made was magnified under their scrutiny, her presence a ripple in the still pond of their world. Victor's eyes followed her movements, calculating, detached, while she clutched the edge of the table, leaning slightly forward as if to bridge the gap between what was expected and what needed to be said. The stark contrast, her worn hoodie, scuffed shoes, notebook pressed to her chest, against the room's gleaming perfection, made her almost invisible yet impossible to ignore. Every subtle breath she drew, the click of her pen on the table, seemed amplified in the hush, tension coiling like a spring ready to snap. Outside the panoramic windows, the city thrummed with life, unaware of this quiet confrontation, of the young woman standing between order and the reckoning she was about to voice, carrying knowledge, risk, and courage into a world that had no reason to listen, but would have no choice soon enough. Jocelyn Harper's fingers hovered over the contract, the fine lines of print blurring under the harsh fluorescent lights, each word a potential trap for anyone careless enough to sign. She exhaled, steadying herself as the hum of computers and soft typing in the background reminded her of the audience she had no right to command, executives perched like hawks, each calculating glance a silent verdict on her audacity. Taking a deliberate step forward, she placed her notebook on the polished mahogany table, tapping the page to catch Victor Langley's attention. "Sir," she said, voice low but unwavering, "this clause, it shifts all liability to Langley Holdings. If signed, it could expose the company to lawsuits, defaults, even bankruptcy." The words fell like stones into the still room, ripples of tension spreading as assistants stiffened, laptops closing with soft clicks. Victor's gaze narrowed, a faint flash of irritation crossing his face, but he remained seated, fingers drumming lightly against the table as though testing her nerve. Jocelyn felt a tremor of risk coil in her chest. Speak wrong, and she would be dismissed, ridiculed, perhaps permanently marked as trouble. Yet the truth burned hotter than fear, and she pressed on, pointing to the exact paragraph, her finger tracing the line with deliberate care. A soft murmur rippled through the room. One assistant leaned over, lips parted in incredulity, whispering to another, but Jocelyn held the room with the clarity of her conviction. Derek coughed nervously, eyes darting between her and Victor, and Clara's posture stiffened, hand lightly clutching a pen like it could anchor her calm. Every eye was on Jocelyn now, the contrast stark. A young janitor's daughter standing in a room of titans, her hoodie and scuffed sneakers a visual protest against the polished walls, the designer suits, the invisible hierarchy that seemed to hum with authority. Her heart thudded against her ribcage, each beat echoing the stakes. Ridicule, dismissal, perhaps even the wrath of a CEO who had never been contradicted. Yet, despite the peril, Jocelyn's voice remained precise, unwavering. If the team doesn't read carefully, the company could be liable for millions. This clause isn't protection. It's a setup. A sharp intake of breath echoed behind her. A junior analyst's eyes widened, not daring to speak, sensing the storm she had just unleashed. Victor Langley leaned forward, tilting his head slightly, lips pressing into a thin line, the tension radiating like heat from a metal surface. Jocelyn met his eyes, steady, unflinching, every nerve alert, knowing that this single act of intervention could save the company, or cost her everything she had worked for. Derek's chair scraped softly as he straightened. Clara's fingers flexed around the pen, the room vibrating with the unsaid question. Would the CEO snap, dismiss her instantly, or would he see the truth? The seconds stretched, thick with anticipation. Jocelyn's heartbeat loud in her own ears, yet her demeanor calm, a deliberate mask over the adrenaline racing through her veins. She had crossed invisible boundaries, trespassed social codes, and dared to speak up where silence was expected, offering knowledge in a room unprepared to receive it, risking her position, her dignity, and perhaps her chance to return another day. And just as Victor's hand hovered over his pen, the tiniest flicker of doubt crossing his features, Jocelyn realized the tension had shifted. She had forced a pause in the machinery of power itself, holding the next move in her hands, without knowing how it would end. Jocelyn Harper froze as Victor Langley's gaze sharpened, the faint click of his pen snapping through the heavy silence like a whip. His lips pressed into a thin line, jaw taut, every inch of his posture radiating disapproval, a living wall of authority pressing down on her chest. "How dare you?" he said finally, voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "Interfere with decisions far beyond your station." The words hit her like cold water, and her stomach tightened, breath caught mid-cycle, the risk she had taken materializing in raw, palpable tension. Derek leaned back, smirking, eyes glinting with cruel amusement, whispering just loud enough for others to hear. "Who does she think she is?" Clara's eyebrows arched sharply, lips pressed thin, her silence a needle, threaded with doubt and judgment, as if every person in the room was a mirror reflecting Jocelyn's supposed audacity. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls inching closer, the fluorescent lights too bright, too harsh, illuminating the faint tremor in her hand as she gripped the edge of the table. Her heart thundered against her ribs, each beat echoing the cold reality of her vulnerability. Dismissal, ridicule, perhaps worse, waiting for her like a storm outside the marble glass. Victor's eyes narrowed, pinning her with a chill that cut deeper than any physical discomfort, every syllable he spoke layering pressure. "You have no right to question this, and your assumptions could have jeopardized millions. Do you understand?" The boardroom seemed to hold its breath, the assistants frozen mid-gesture, laptops closed, pens paused, each second stretching impossibly long. Jocelyn's jaw tightened, but she could feel the eyes on her, weighing, judging, dissecting her every reaction, and the subtle quiver in her fingers betrayed the storm of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Derek's laughter slipped out, thin, mocking, bouncing off the marble, a predator's taunt, while Clara shook her head, muttering under her breath about the impropriety, about overstepping bounds that were not hers. The air was thick, a weight pressing down on her shoulders, making each breath deliberate, each movement calculated. Her body tense with the high-wire risk she had willingly embraced. She could feel the collective disbelief, a current of silent accusation running through the room, every polished surface reflecting her smallness, her outsider status, her supposed audacity. Victor rose slowly, each movement deliberate, authoritative, the sound of his shoes on marble punctuating the mounting pressure, stopping a mere step from the table as he towered over her, his shadow swallowing the worn lanyard around her neck, the hoodie clinging to her frame. "Do you expect to be taken seriously in this environment?" he asked, voice slicing clean through the stagnant air. The question rhetorical, meant to humiliate, to expose her as an intruder. Jocelyn swallowed hard, tongue dry, yet the glint of resolve in her eyes remained, though her chest ached from the constriction of fear and defiance. The assistants shifted uncomfortably, a ripple of unease spreading as Victor's gaze scanned the room, settling finally back on her, the silence so absolute it pressed against her ears, making the tick of the clock deafening, each second a hammer against her resolve. Derek leaned forward suddenly, smirk turning into an edge of malice, whispering, "Do you really think you can fix what's above your pay grade?" The words were meant to wound, to push her into retreat, but Jocelyn felt a spark of clarity. This was the pressure test, the social gauntlet, the defining moment she had to navigate. Her lips parted slightly, ready to defend, to speak, yet she felt the weight of every possible consequence. Humiliation, loss of employment, disapproval, the subtle yet powerful threat of erasure from a world that did not tolerate challenge from someone in her position. Victor's hand hovered above the contract, a pause heavy with menace, the silence expanding into an almost tangible force, and she realized that any misstep now could undo everything she had risked, expose her to scorn and derision, mark her as insubordinate in the minds of those whose approval meant currency in this cold, precise ecosystem. Her pulse rattled in her ears, the fluorescent lights glaring overhead, reflecting off the polished surface like accusation. Each breath she drew felt like an act of rebellion, each heartbeat a drum of defiance against the subtle tyranny of expectation. The room held her in a vice of observation, every motion scrutinized, every flicker of emotion magnified. The collision of her humanity and their detached authority electric, nerve-tingling, and impossible to ignore. And as Victor's gaze hardened, the smirk of Derek still lingering, and Clara's judgmental posture unyielding, Jocelyn Harper stood in the epicenter of the storm she had triggered, knowing that the coming moments would determine whether she would be crushed under the weight of authority, or if the truth she carried would finally pierce the sterile armor of privilege. The next words she uttered a hinge upon which the entire boardroom might pivot, leaving the outcome uncertain, the stakes absolute, and every observer holding their breath, waiting for the implosion or the revelation that no one yet saw coming. The room finally exhaled, though the tension lingered like fog clinging to glass walls. Jocelyn Harper stepped back, letting the echo of her own heartbeat fill the space where the confrontation had thundered moments before. Light streamed unevenly through the blinds, cutting the polished marble floors into stripes of gold and shadow, brushing across her hoodie, highlighting the worn edges, the laces of her sneakers. Small markers of a life lived quietly, yet fully awake. She inhaled slowly, tasting the faint scent of coffee, paper, and the lingering antiseptic air, each breath grounding her, each exhale a release of adrenaline and fear. The world outside the towering windows moved in oblivious rhythm, cars humming, distant sirens, the shuffle of pedestrians. But inside, the stillness was almost tactile, heavy yet intimate, reflecting the storm she carried within her chest. Jocelyn's fingers brushed against the notebook she had pressed to her side, feeling the ridges of the pages beneath her skin. The contract's ink a reminder of the risk she had dared to take. The sunlight shifted, faint dust motes floating in the slanting beams like fragile specks of hope, and she let herself notice the warmth that contrasted the cold precision of the boardroom. Her knees felt weak, her shoulders heavy, yet there was a quiet dignity in standing through the storm, in surviving scrutiny without compromise. In the soft hiss of the air vents, the distant echo of typing from other offices, Jocelyn realized how often the world overlooked small courage, how easily quiet acts were dismissed, but that did not make them insignificant. She pressed a hand to the table, steadying herself against the sudden vertigo of relief and anticipation, letting the pulse of her own resolve settle her, heartbeat aligning with the measured light and air around her. The faint reflection of her eyes in the glass wall caught her attention. They were steady, bright, alive with awareness of the fragile balance she had navigated, of the invisible line she had walked, between obedience and assertion, fear and principle. A slow exhale, a barely audible breath, and the sunlight warmed the side of her face, soft as a whisper, carrying the quiet truth. Courage was often invisible, but in its silence, it was uncompromising. And in that pause, with the shadows stretching long and the golden light flickering across her chest, Jocelyn Harper stood unshaken, feeling the weight of consequence, yet sensing, with the subtlest certainty, that the next moment would carry the echo of everything she had risked, a moment suspended between revelation and the unknown. Victor Langley's hand froze midair, hovering above the contract, the weight of Jocelyn Harper's words suddenly palpable in the room like an unseen current. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he reread the clause she had flagged, each line now glaring with clarity, each legal implication slicing through his prior assumptions. The assistants, previously tense with judgment, shifted uneasily, their murmurs subdued, eyes wide as realization began to ripple across the polished boardroom. "Wait, this isn't just a minor error," Victor whispered under his breath, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features. Jocelyn's heart pounded, a mix of tension and anticipation, as the room seemed to contract around the sudden pivot of power. Derek's smirk faltered, replaced with a thin line of shock. Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes darting between Victor and Jocelyn as if seeing them both for the first time. Victor's fingers traced the margin of the contract, the inked words now screaming the truth he had almost ignored. Had the merger been signed, Langley Holdings would have absorbed the full financial liability, risking millions, exposing the company to lawsuits, defaults, potential collapse. The logic hit him in waves, each one sharper than the last, and he exhaled sharply, the breath rattling in his chest, echoing against the marble walls. Jocelyn stood motionless, a pillar of calm amidst the tremor of revelation, her eyes steady, holding the gravity of what she had uncovered, knowing that this recognition shifted the balance in a heartbeat. Victor's gaze lifted slowly, locking onto hers, a mixture of astonishment, respect, and reluctant admiration painting his face. The boardroom, once a fortress of polished authority, now felt hollow, every hierarchy of privilege momentarily suspended by the undeniable proof she had presented. Derek's whispered apology slipped past his lips, barely audible, a recognition that the casual contempt he had displayed now seemed baseless, almost absurd in light of the clarity Jocelyn had provided. Clara's fingers flexed around her pen, tension uncoiling as understanding settled, a quiet acknowledgement that the judgment cast upon Jocelyn had been premature, misinformed. Victor straightened fully, the chair creaking beneath him, a visual sign of the shift. Power, once assumed, now required reevaluation. "You were right," he said, voice low, measured, carrying weight not just in authority but in revelation, the words slicing through the residual tension like a blade. Jocelyn's pulse raced, the adrenaline of risk now tempered by the vindication she had earned. The very room that had loomed oppressively over her now bending subtly under the gravity of her insight. The sun slanted through the blinds, casting stripes of gold across the floor, illuminating her scuffed sneakers, highlighting the contrast between the world she had entered and the authority she had now partially commanded. Victor's hand lingered over the contract before him, the shift complete, the ledger of power recalibrated. He no longer held absolute sway. Her intervention had asserted truth over hierarchy. Jocelyn allowed herself the faintest exhale, feeling the electric charge of recognition. The room alive with a sudden, silent consensus that her knowledge, her courage, her willingness to act against expectation, had rewritten the assumptions of everyone present. Derek swallowed. Clara blinked rapidly, Victor's eyes softened slightly, all of them witnessing the emergent authority of someone who had nothing but her insight and resolve. And in that instant, the boardroom's dynamic had inverted, the powerful humbled, the underestimated elevated, leaving the air thick with anticipation for what would come next, and every observer caught between awe, surprise, and the unspoken acknowledgement. Jocelyn Harper had altered the course of the room, without a title, without privilege, solely through the weight of truth and daring to speak it. Victor Langley exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders, easing as he reached for Jocelyn Harper's hand lightly on the contract, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than command. His eyes softened, the sharp edge of authority replaced with genuine recognition, as he said, "Jocelyn, I owe you an apology. I misjudged you, your insight, your courage. This should have been recognized from the start." The assistants shifted subtly, sensing the release of the unspoken weight that had pressed down on the room. The hum of computers now background music to a calmer, steadier rhythm. Jocelyn's lips curved into a subtle smile, a quiet grace that did not seek validation, her dignity intact despite the power imbalance that had defined the morning. She nodded, letting the moment linger, letting her presence affirm the truth of her actions without needing to demand acknowledgement. Victor gestured toward the open contract, his voice measured, almost gentle. "I want you to lead the review on this deal. We need your expertise, not just your caution." Jocelyn straightened, taking a slow breath, the familiar pulse of adrenaline replaced with a warmth that spread through her chest, a resonance of trust and recognition. The sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting long stripes across the polished floors, reflecting off the glass like quiet applause, and she noticed the contrast. The room that had felt oppressive now carried a sense of potential, of shared purpose, the hierarchy softened by understanding. Victor's fingers traced the margin of the contract again, careful, deliberate, a silent promise of correction and oversight, and Jocelyn observed without interruption, knowing she could stand firm, that her voice mattered, that her intervention had altered the course of action without anger, without retribution. Derek exhaled. Clara relaxed her grip on the pen, and the room seemed to breathe collectively, the previous rigidity of authority giving way to acknowledgement of competence and moral clarity. Jocelyn shifted slightly, feeling the weight of every unspoken word and every restrained breath, the subtle approval, the absence of ridicule, the quiet respect, and let herself experience the relief of integrity preserved. Victor's gaze lingered on her for a moment, the softening of his expression a signal that the lesson had been learned, that trust could be extended even across the gulf of power, that mistakes were human and courage deserved recognition. Jocelyn's own hands rested on the table, steady now, the tremor gone, her presence a calm center as the light shifted, highlighting the worn edges of her lanyard, the scuffed sneakers, the faint dust in the sunlight. Markers of a life lived quietly, now illuminated by acknowledgement, by the soft ripple of change that did not hum with triumph, but with subtle, resonant humanity. The room settled into a rhythm that honored both authority and insight, power tempered by awareness, and Jocelyn knew the impact of her act would carry beyond the contract, beyond the room, into the small corners where courage and patience intersect. She allowed herself a slow exhale, shoulders easing, heart still humming with the residue of risk, as Victor's quiet apology and measured invitation to lead echoed in her ears. A tangible validation of truth prevailing without spectacle, the emotional weight of the morning now balancing into a steady, unspoken acknowledgement of dignity and human connection. Jocelyn Harper stepped lightly down the marble hallway, the soft click of her worn sneakers echoing against the cold walls. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long golden stripes across the floor, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams like tiny suspended stars. She paused at the glass doors, fingers brushing against the smooth surface, catching her reflection briefly. Her hoodie faded, lanyard worn, eyes steady and calm. The office behind her was quiet now, empty chairs and polished tables holding the ghosts of the morning's storm. A single curtain fluttered in a faint draft, moving like a slow heartbeat across the room. Jocelyn exhaled, breath visible in the cool air, the tension of risk and revelation dissolving into silence. Outside, the city pulsed faintly through the glass, distant traffic, a bird cutting across the sky. Yet inside, the light held her alone, a solitary figure framed in quiet authority. She walked toward the elevators, hand grazing. The wall, the sunlight shifting with each step, her shadow stretching long ahead, stretching toward the unknown. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, swallowing her figure in gleaming metal, and as she descended, the floor-to-ceiling windows reflected only the empty hallway, the echo of footsteps fading, leaving the space suspended, waiting, resonant, a pause heavy with unspoken consequence. She stepped out into the sunlight, the tension of the boardroom still lingering in her chest, a quiet weight in every step. If you were holding the truth that could change everything but feared the judgment of everyone around you, would you speak up anyway? Take a moment to imagine that choice, and feel free to share what you might do in that same situation.